Today we're going to be using fairy tales to help us understand better what life was like in the Middle Ages. Before we can do that, we are going to start with a review of what society was like after the fall of ancient Rome. So if we think back to our former unit on ancient Rome, we know that Rome eventually falls. Now, not all of ancient Rome falls. The eastern part of Rome continues and lives on and flourishes. However, Western Rome falls due to barbarian invasions in part, and all of society falls apart. The outcome is we have chaos, and many small kingdoms start to form all throughout what was once Western Rome. And so you have many different monarchies that are very small that are dotted all throughout what was once Western Rome. So what we're going to look at today is daily life after the fall of ancient Rome. So how did the fall of Rome impact the life of average people? One thing that we do remember is that life became very, very difficult for the people who lived during this time period. But what was their daily life like? And another question that we're going to think about is, why do we need to study this? Well, one of the reasons that we are going to study this is so that as we learn about events and things that occurred, we can evaluate the choices people made and the events that happened based on what life was like at the time and not what life was like today. Because what life was like at the time is going to drive the choices people make, and it's important to understand that it was different than what it was like today. So we're going to use fairy tales to help us understand what daily life would have been like. Many fairy tales happen during the time period of the Middle Ages. So we can kind of use fairy tales and draw inferences on the way people behave and events that happen to help us understand better what life was like. And remember, that's our goal for today. We're going to start today by looking at an unknown, well, not unknown, but probably unknown to you fairy tale called Diamonds and Toads, which is a French fairy tale. In this fairy tale, we have many elements that can tell us more about how people lived and what life was like. So when we're done with this fairy tale, you're going to do the same thing that I'm going to model for you right now, which is to read the fairy tale, try and make inferences about daily life of the people who lived during this time period, and then you're going to have an opportunity to do that with fairy tales on your own. So our first fairy tale is called Diamonds and Toads, and it is a French fairy tale. A bad-tempered old widow had 2 daughters. Her older daughter, Fanny, was disagreeable and proud, but looked and behaved like her mother, and therefore was her favorite child. Her younger daughter, Rose, was sweet, gentle, and beautiful, but resembled her late father. Jealous and bitter, the widow and her favorite daughter abused and mistreated the younger girl. One day, while drawing water from the well, an old woman asked the younger girl for a drink of water. The girl politely consented, and after giving it, she found that the woman was a fairy who had taken the guise of a crone to test the character of morals. So let's take a break here and try and draw some inferences from what we've heard so far. First, the girl is said to be drawing water from the well. So what we know and can infer based on this fact is that people had to work for basic necessities like clean drinking water. And so going to the well and drawing water would be one aspect of working for things that we might take for granted today, like drinking water. Next, they discuss a crone or beggar appearing in the story. And we can infer from this that many people were poor at the time or considered beggars. And the evidence that many people were is that nobody really seems to be surprised that a beggar woman appears at this point in the story. And then third, there's an appearance of a fairy. Now, what I can infer from this, if I think deeply about it, is that life was very difficult. Because life was very difficult, the only way to escape this difficult life would be to have some form of magic take you away from your hard life. Okay, back to the story. As the girl was so kind and compassionate toward her, the beggar, the fairy blessed her with having either a jewel or precious metal or pretty flower fall from her mouth whenever she spoke. Upon arriving home and explaining why she took so long to her mother, the widow was delighted at the sight of precious metals, jewels, and flowers falling from the girl's lips, and desired that her favored eldest daughter, Fanny, should have the gift as well. Fanny protested, but the widow forcibly sent her to the well with instruction to act kindly toward an old beggar woman. Fanny set off, but the fairy appeared as a fine princess and requested that the girl draw her a drink from the well. The elder daughter spoke rudely to the fairy and insulted her. The fairy decreed that, as punishment for her despicable attitude, either a toad or snake would fall from Fanny's mouth whenever she spoke. So we're going to take a break here and see what inferences we can make. One inference I can make from the fact that jewels would fall from her mouth as a payment for a good deed is that one type of currency could be jewels, maybe rubies or emeralds or diamonds, which would be similar to something today. Another inference is that people were considered good, that they might have some sort of positive thing happen to them for that behavior. Okay, when Fanny arrived home, she told her story to her mother, and disgusting toads and snakes fell from her mouth with each word. The widow, in a fury, drove her younger daughter out of the house. In the woods, she met a king's son who fell in love with her and married her. In time, even the widow was sickened by her older daughter and drove her out, and she died alone and miserable in the woods. The older daughter dies in the woods. The younger daughter meets a prince in the woods. So what I can infer from that is that people lived near woods. So an inference I can draw is that people lived in small communities. And why would you want to live near woods? Well, there would be wild animals there, which would allow you to hunt, which would give you a food source, because if you remember, people are living subsistence living there, not able to go to a grocery store and have food there for them. Another inference I can make is that because there is a prince, governments were monarchies often during that time, and because there's a prince in the woods, I can also infer that kingdoms were small and many, so that there were many kingdoms all throughout Europe. And I know Europe because this is set in France. So, what is your goal at this point? You are going to find a fairy tale from the books supplied in the classroom. As you read the fairy tale that you chose, you will write down all the inferences you can make about daily life that you draw from that story. After that, as a class, we're going to make a list of all the inferences drawn from all the different fairy tales read in class. So we'll have quite a large list, and we'll be able to take a look at it and everyone's different ideas and sort of understand maybe more about what people were like in the Middle Ages. We're going to keep these lists, and we'll be able to check off correct or even incorrect inferences as we learn more about the Middle Ages. So this will be something that we continue to work off of throughout the whole unit. Remember, what your goal is to understand what daily life was like so that you evaluate events and people and things that happen in the Middle Ages from the prospect of the people who lived at the time and not today.